caught up today. I watched both the last two videos.
Cool. Good evening again, everybody. It's 7 o'clock, so if y'all want to come forward up to the study area, if you're going to be moving, it'd be great to have you up this way, closer in. So we'll get started in a moment. A few housekeeping items as we get started. I know that some of you all have had to miss the live sessions, and I was told tonight that that the video ones work really well. So if you miss an evening and you want to watch it online, we did send out the link last week, which I'm grateful for. So you can watch a session if you miss it. So it's always a good thing. Also, a reminder that next week is fall break, so we will not meet next week here. So our next session will be 2 weeks from tonight. And the topic came up, how far should we be going in our reading? We're covering a lot of material this semester and not equally in depth. So if you want to read the first 5 books of the Bible, just be reading ahead. So we're going to be finishing up with Abraham and Sarah this evening, so that'll take us through about chapter 25. Our next session will take place on October 17th, and we'll be talking about Isaac and Jacob, so chapters 24 through 36. And then on the 24th, we'll finish up with the story of Joseph. Then Halloween, we won't meet. We have 2 weeks on Exodus. One of those got bumped. One evening got bumped to 12/12, if y'all remember. So we'll send out a revised list of dates. And then the last evening will be Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's a lot of reading, but we just can't cover everything in the same depth. So, all right. So last week we began to look at the figure of Abraham and Sarah, and the beginning of what we call the ancestral stories. So we're now in basically the ancestral narratives or sagas, those stories about the ancestors of God's people that they had handed down. Now, in the book that I referenced early on by Walter Brueggemann, he says when you're reading Genesis, and maybe you pick this up as you're reading it, that the stories that Israel handed on are certainly, there's been a narrator at the end, an editor, who has certainly integrated them into a kind of a weaving, and there's an overarching theme about Abraham and Sarah, which is the God of promise, God's great promise, and Abraham's faithfulness. But you can also, if you read the text carefully, you can see that the final editors made no attempt to smooth everything out. So you have a lot of things that are kind of mixtures of things. So some of the narratives don't present Abraham in quite the same positive light. And you read certain stories that you're like, why is this in the Bible? Did you have that experience with some of the narratives? Almost all of them have a reason, obviously, or they wouldn't be there. But some of them are more immediately obvious than others. Let's just put it that way. We'll see a few of those tonight. And last week we really started with, the fundamental call of God to Abram in chapter 12, and how Abram was going to be called by God to go forth to a land that I will show you, and you will be a blessing, and all the nations of the world will find blessing through you. So if you understand the great theological horizon, in a sense, after the fall, the curse on the nations in Genesis 1 through 11 following creation, Abraham is God's plan to begin to unravel the curse that has fallen upon humanity as a result of the fall. So thus, God counters a curse with a blessing. And the blessing of Abraham. Marty.
Question. I don't understand yet why it was necessary to have Abraham have a son with Hagar. I mean, I realize you said the Jewish people trace their heritage back, but that's not, we're not told that in the beginning. I mean,
So yeah, why did he have a child through Hagar? Well, the obvious reading in the text itself is that Abraham and Sarah were given the promise of God that they would have a child, but at different moments, both Abraham and Sarah began to doubt whether it's going to happen. So that was Sarah's plan.
But they don't count that child, Hagar. They don't count Ishmael as being the son that God promised, do they?
It's not the son that God promised.
No, because but at the time they had, so that's like, this is kind of an aside.
Well, those stories were handed down, and so, Ishmael, the narratives about Ishmael, there's some connection to Abraham there, and it also shows you that, in the ancient world, at that period of Israel's ancestors, what we would call today monogamy was not strictly followed, right? So, yeah, there was a different horizon of moral expectation in those early ancestors. So, so we saw some very interesting narratives last week, and the recurring promise of God. Abraham, you will have descendants as numerous as the stars of the heavens and the sands of the seashore. And that's all going to come through the promise of a son. We haven't had the son yet, right? Isaac or laughter has not shown up on the scene yet, but we keep hearing of the promise that the Lord will give him a child. And the second promise, the land. I will give you this land perpetually. So the land, a son, and thereby descendants. So, and by the end, you'll see Abraham became a rather wealthy man. Lots of male and female servants, and lots of cattle and flocks. He was quite a wealthy shepherd by the end. He possessed many things by the end of his life. So we're going to start tonight with chapter 18. I think chapter 18 is one of those great pivotal narratives in the book of Genesis. This encounter with Abraham and Sarah is, you could call it in a sense, the central narrative of promise in the Abraham stories. So we begin chapter 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the terebinth of Mamre as he sat in the entrance of his tent while the day was growing hot. So what's the context? Backstory, Abram and Sarah are nomadic shepherds. They journey. And in the ancient world, one of the most important, universally accepted moral demands was that whenever someone appeared on the horizon, a stranger as it were, you had a moral obligation, grave moral obligation, to care for that stranger. So whatever they needed, food, shelter, water, you would provide. And if they took refuge in your home, they were under your protective care. This is probably one of the most grave and serious moral obligations of the whole ancient world. And to this day, the Bedouin cultures still respect that a great deal. So, grave obligation. Why? Because when you're a traveler on the horizon in the ancient world, your life is always in peril. You always have need of hospitality. So the basic biblical call to be hospitable to the stranger, to welcome the stranger, is deeply rooted all the way back to Abraham. So looking up, he saw three men standing nearby. So Abraham is now meeting three strangers. He doesn't know it's the Lord yet, by the way. We heard that in the title of the story. When he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "Sir, if I may ask you this favor, please do not go on past your servant. Let some water be brought, that you may bathe your feet, and then rest yourselves under the tree. Now that you've come this close to your servant, let me bring you a little food, that you may refresh yourselves, and afterward you may go on your way." "Very well," they replied, "do as you have said. Now, what have you noticed already?" in the narrative. Some interesting grammatical things have happened. We've been alternating between the singular and the plural. Like there's three, then there's one. He said to him, and they said, 1 and 3. So Abraham hastened into the tent and told Sarah, quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it, and make rolls. He ran to the herd, picked out a tender, choice steer, and gave it to a servant who quickly prepared it. Then he got some curds and milk as well as the steer that had been prepared and set these before them, and he waited on them under the tree while they ate. What is Abraham doing?
He's being a host.
He's being a host. The ancient law of hospitality, to welcome the stranger, Abraham has not only done that, but he has done it in spades. I mean, he has put on a feast for these strangers. You know, he picked one of the finest, choicest animals and had it slaughtered. He had them wash their feet with water. You get the sense that this is unfolding over time. Have a seat. Let me bring you water. Probably the washing of the feet, the water to drink. Let me get you some food. And he has fine flour. Sarah's making rolls. This is going to take a while for these things to bake and a while to prepare the steer, even though it's quickly, you know. I mean, he is treating these 3 strangers as if they're kings. I mean, he's pulled out all the stops out in the desert. Where is your wife Sarah? They asked him. They're in the tent, he replied. One of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will then have a son. This is the heart of the promise of God. Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent just behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years, and Sarah had stopped having her womanly periods. So Sarah laughed to herself and said, now that I'm so withered and my husband is so old, am I still to have sexual pleasure? But the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I really bear a child old as I am? Is anything too marvelous for the Lord to do? At the appointed time, about this time next year, I will return to you, and Sarah will have a son. Because she was afraid, Sarah dissembled, saying, I didn't laugh. But he said, yes, you did. So this is an archetypal story, probably one of the most important narratives about Abraham and Sarah. So what does the word angel mean in Hebrew? Messenger, right? So messengers could be spirits, conceivably, in the Old Testament. They could also be human beings. So these 3 human beings could be messengers of the Lord. It seems to imply that they are sent by the Lord or messengers of the Lord. But you also have this alternation that it seems to be the Lord himself. So the Lord shows up hidden in 3 strangers. So there's a deep truth beneath that. And it's already kind of, as Christians, we should be thinking a little bit about Matthew 25 when Jesus says, when you fed the hungry, you were actually feeding me. When you clothed the naked, you were clothing me. When you gave water to the thirsty, it was me you gave water to. So that God is appearing to Abraham and Sarah in the form of 3 strangers whom they show great hospitality to. And this opens them to receive the great blessing of the promised child. Next 1 year, you're going to have a son named, and they will name him Isaac because Sarah's laughing about it in the tent, right? So the recurring theme throughout the Old Testament in Genesis is there's always a challenge with having the next baby, the next generation, and Sarah's the first great example of that. This will also point us as Christians forward to the New Testament, right? Elizabeth and Zachary have been waiting, never able to have a baby, and now John appears. And also, even more remarkably in the New Testament, a virgin is with child in Nazareth. And so that's a unique departure from simply being sterile or way beyond the years of fertility. So, so this scene, by the way, for our Jewish brothers and sisters, is a prototypical scene of hospitality. So if you're a good Jew, this is what you do. You welcome strangers. You give hospitality and welcome. That's a constitutive part of who you are. And so this scene of Abraham and Sarah is so important for them in terms of welcoming strangers. Now it's interesting, in the Christian tradition, so I always say we as Christians look back at these ancient stories of Israel with a new set of glasses. And our new set of glasses has been shaped and formed by the dying and rising of Jesus from the dead. And later in Christian tradition, of course, a clearly developed theology of the Trinity, God as three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. So in the tradition of the Eastern icons, there's a great tradition of depicting these three strangers at table with Abraham and Sarah in the desert. So you have, with a terebinth in the backdrop. So you have typically depicted, and I've brought it out at Trinity Sunday, you have depicted a table, and you have the three strangers seated around the table, and the open side of the table is towards us while we're looking at the image of the icon. And so for Christians, the three strangers represent God indeed in a Trinitarian way. God is three persons. So for us, that icon becomes an icon of the Trinity itself, God, Father, or Himself, God, Father, Son, and Spirit. And the way that the icon is understood is that the fourth side is open because God is inviting us to dine with God, Father, Son, and Spirit. We're to become part of the divine life of God, or part of the Trinity. So this is looking back at the ancient Hebrew story and seeing it through the lenses of a developed theology of the Trinity. So, but that's where Christians have understood where the story goes. So multi-dimensions when you reinterpret a story from a faith perspective over time. Questions about this narrative? I think it's a really beautiful and important narrative. If you ever have a chance to look up the icon of Rublev, who did the Trinity, these three guests, and to pray with it especially, it's a wonderful icon to pray with. All right, this prepares us for the next set of narratives, and these three strangers, sometimes one, sometimes three, continue in the narrative that follows. And the next text begins to have to do with Sodom and Gomorrah. So you all probably are also deeply aware that in Western civilization, Sodom and Gomorrah became identified with homosexuality. And the reason for that is, we'll see in the text itself, is that the people of Sodom show up at Lot's house and they demand that Lot turn over these visiting strangers for intercourse. So basically they're going to rape them. So it's a pretty horrific scene. One of my friends who's a biblical scholar says in the Old Testament we run into these, what he calls texts of terror. Or terrifying things happen in them. And we're about to run into some of that terrifying stuff that happens. And it's terrifying on a lot of different levels. It's not just one level. There are multiple layers of kind of horror, you know. So, and remember Lot. Lot is Abraham's nephew, and Lot will become the ancestor of Israel's enemies, the Moabites and the Ammonites. So Israel doesn't have a lot of positive feeling about the Moabites and the Ammonites, the enemies on their east. So when they tell the stories of the origin of the ancestors of their enemies, it's not going to be a flattering origin for their enemies. You'll see that in the text. The men, presuming the three men that Abraham and Sarah have just been very hospitable to. So really, okay, if Abraham and Sarah are the archetype of hospitality, the people of Sodom are the archetype of the opposite of hospitality, abusing a stranger when you have the opportunity to abuse a stranger. So the very opposite of hospitality. The men set out from there and looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to see them on their way. The Lord reflected, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Now that he is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to find blessing in him. So this is referring us back to chapter 12, that priestly blessing that Abraham is to be. Indeed, I have singled him out that he may direct his sons and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, that the Lord may carry into effect for Abraham the promises made about him. This is rich theology of promise. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grave that I must go down and see whether or not their actions fully correspond to the cry against them and that comes to me. I mean to find out. So the cry of what's happening in these wicked cities. Now remember that Lot, Abraham's nephew, when asked what land he wanted, he picked what he thought was the best land. Well, that's also the land where Sodom and Gomorrah fall, and Lot ends up living in Sodom with these people. So it sort of gives you a sense of what the biblical author thinks about Lot's choices, what kind of people he chooses to live with. While the two men walked on farther towards Sodom, the Lord remained standing before Abraham. Then Abraham drew nearer to him and said, will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty? So this text, like the testing of Abraham and also the three strangers, does show up in our lectionary. And this is probably one of the most famous dialogues with God between God and Abraham. We've heard it at Mass. So, Abraham basically asked God, what if there's only 50 innocent people in the city? Are you going to wipe out the whole city and also kill the 50 innocent? And the Lord basically says, no, if there's 50 innocent people, I'll spare the whole city for them. And Abraham then says, well, what if there's just 5 less? 5 more wicked people. There's only 45 good people. The Lord says, okay, I'll spare it for them. He gets them all the way down to 10. There's only 10 people in the city who are good. God says to Abraham, I will spare the entire city for the sake of those 10. It shows you something about the great mercy of God, doesn't it? And it also shows you what a positive impact a few good people can make in a society. So when you think, gosh, the whole society seems bad, well, it's even more important that you be one of the 10 people who are trying to be like Abraham, good and righteous, walking with the Lord in fidelity. Who knows? But the goodness of people may have spared humanity from much graver evils in the past that we don't even know about. So we never underestimate the goodness. But I also like the fact that Abraham has this open dialogue with God. It shows us that, we as prayers can have conversation with God about things. On Wednesday evenings, we have RCIA in here, and one of the folks who's exploring whether to become Catholic or not grew up an Orthodox Jew. And he said, we were talking about one of the things about prayer is that we're always invited to surrender to God. And he said, well, before you say that, the name Israel is the one who struggles with God, contends with God. And there is this holy tradition, a holy Jewish tradition it has Abraham involved in it, Moses, Jacob, who becomes Israel. They have arguments with God. They have debates with God. They try to convince God of things, and God listens. So you have this wonderful give and take. It's not just whatever your will is, God. It's no, let's talk about this, God. Let's struggle with this and work through it. You're not going to wipe out the whole city, are you? So you have this honest relationship. I think it's a good model for prayer. God's protective care over his servants. Then the angel said to Lot, "Who else belongs to you here? Your sons or sons-in-law and your daughters and all who belong to you in the city, take them away from it. We are about to destroy this place, for the outcry reaching the Lord against those in the city is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who had contracted marriage with his daughters. "Get up and leave this place," he told them. "The Lord is about to destroy the city." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. They did not take him seriously. As dawn was breaking, the angels urged Lot on, saying, "On your way, take with you your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." When he hesitated, the man, by the Lord's mercy, seized his hand and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters and led them to safety outside the city. This hesitance to leave on the part of Lot, have to drag him out. As soon as they had been brought outside, he was told, "Flee for your life. Don't look back or stop anywhere on the plain. Get off to the hills at once, or you will be swept away." "Oh no, my lord," replied Lot. "You have already thought enough of your servant to do me the great kindness of intervening to save my life. But I cannot flee to the hills to keep the disaster from overtaking me, and so I shall die. Look, this town ahead is near enough to escape to. It's only a small place. Let me flee there. It's a small place, isn't it? That my life may be saved." "Well then," he replied, "I will also grant you the favor you now ask. I will not overthrow the town you speak of. Hurry, escape there. I cannot do anything until you arrive there." And that is why the town is called Zoar, which means small place. So, this was the narrative gets handed down in Israel's history. That little place there, when they found that the area of Sodom that had been utterly destroyed, they found this little town nearby still doing well. So it survived the devastation. The sun was just rising over the earth as Lot arrived in Zoar. At the same time, the Lord rained down sulfurous rain upon Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of heaven. He overthrew those cities, literally turned them over, and the whole plain. So some scholars speculate, because it uses that phraseology in Hebrew, it turns it over, that it was like an earthquake, so the earth turning upside down and the sulfurous fire coming out. So that's one attempt to understand. So if you go to the area of the Dead Sea to this day, those plains around it are hot and dry. So they look like a devastation or a destruction in a way. He overthrew those cities and the whole plain together with the inhabitants of the cities and the produce of the soil. But Lot's wife looked back, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. So it's interesting. There are actually, in that basin, there are features that are made of minerals that look like, pillars, and some of them look like people. So Israel probably saw these columns and thought, that was a person. Wonder what the story behind that was. So, you can see that as the narratives get handed down, the imagination of Israel explaining what they discover in these areas is also at work. But it's also a theologically important note, isn't it? When the Lord is inviting us to go somewhere, if we hesitate and keep looking back, want it to be like it used to be, then the consequences for us are not good. So that's kind of the theological note that's thrown in. And you even sense with Lot, he wasn't all that eager to leave either. He was hesitating. So Lot and his wife, they have a lot in common, actually. Early the next morning, Abraham went to the place where he had stood in the Lord's presence. As he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and the whole region of the plain, he saw dense smoke over the land, rising like fumes from a furnace. Thus it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he was mindful of Abraham by sending Lot away from the upheaval by which God overthrew the cities where Lot had been living. It's almost like God, because Lot was the nephew of Abraham, and Abraham was so good, spared the fate of Lot, his nephew. So this is one of those texts that are kind of texts of terror from Genesis. And, sometimes people associate homosexuality in general with the behavior of the people of Sodom. And that's unfortunate because the real problem is not their orientation, so to speak, but it's their rape and their intention to rape strangers. I mean, this is violence at its worst. So I think that's worth thinking about a bit as you ponder these ancient narratives. Another text of terror follows. Since Lot was afraid to stay in Zoar, he and his 2 daughters went up from Zoar and settled in the hill country where he lived with his 2 daughters in a cave. The older one said to the younger, "Our father is getting old, and there is not a man on earth to unite with us as was the custom everywhere. Come, let us ply our father with wine and then lie with him, that we may have offspring by our father." So incest. So that night they plied their father with wine, and the older one went in and lay with her father, but he was not aware of her lying down or her getting up. Next day the older one said to the younger, "Last night it was I who lay with my father. Let us ply him with wine again tonight, and then you go in and lie with him, that we may both have offspring by our father." So that night too they plied their father with wine, and then the younger one went in and lay with him, but again he was not aware of her lying down or her getting up. So too intoxicated to know what's going on. Thus both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older one gave birth to a son whom she named Moab, saying, "From my father, and he is the ancestor of the Moabites today." So the Moabites are Israel's enemies. We know where they came from, don't we? Incest. He is the ancestor. The younger one said, too, gave birth to a son, and she named him Ammon, saying, "The son of my kin, he is the ancestor of the Ammonites today." So, well, it's a pretty horrific story, isn't it? Right? The humorous side of me says, well, no wonder. He offered them up to be raped by the citizens of Sodom. No wonder they treated him that way. But, and someone asked this last week when we broke into our small group discussions. It's like, why do these things happen in the biblical text? And God doesn't seem to judge the people and say, you've horribly sinned. And I think this is part of the ancient way that Israel told stories. They let the stories, in a sense, speak for themselves and have their own natural consequences. They would have been horrified by incest when these stories were put together in Genesis. So that's a wonderful way of creating an origin story for your mortal enemies. So it's got a darkness to it. But also, you have to understand that's the way ancient storytellers spoke about their enemies. This is one of those places in the book of Genesis, though, that it is harder to find a good theological point for today, right? You won't find this story in our lectionary. Certain parts of the Bible we don't read at Mass. So it's interesting. I always thought it'd be interesting, because about 90% of the Bible ends up in our lectionary. I always thought it would be an interesting thing to go back and just read all the parts that are not anywhere in our lectionary. And we'd probably all be like, oh, I see why they didn't put that in there. So, all right, chapter 20, we go back to Abraham, and this is the chapter that we already looked at about my wife is really my sister, one of those narratives. We've looked at that already. So we'll come to chapter 21, and here we're going to get the birth of Isaac. So he's been promised all the way back to chapter 12, and then we finally get the birth. The Lord took note of Sarah as he had said he would. He did for her as he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time that God had stated. Abraham gave the name Isaac, laughter, to this son of his, whom Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God had commanded. So what's Abraham doing? He's fulfilling the covenant. You gave me the son. I'm going to circumcise him on the 8th day, just as you told us to do. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah then said, God has given me cause to laugh, and all who hear of it will laugh with me. Who would have told Abraham, she added, that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Isaac grew, and on the day of the child's weaning, Abraham held a great feast. So, great celebration. Now, the next little section, Sarah noticed the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. What does this sound like? When Sarah was unhappy with Hagar earlier and sent Ishmael away. This is a different story with different details, but it's basically the same story in a different variant. If you read it carefully, it's probably that there was one original story that came down to Israel in two different forms, two different sources, two different traditions, and both have been preserved in the text. So this one, the first one happens before the birth of Isaac. Already there's this conflict between Hagar and Sarah, and they flee to the desert, and God listens, and no, he's going to be a father also of nations, a wild ass of a man. Very similar kind of dynamics unfold in this chapter. So she demanded of Abraham, drive out that slave and her son. No son of that slave is going to share the inheritance with my son Isaac. Abraham was greatly distressed, especially on account of his son Ishmael. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed about the boy or about your slave woman. Heed the demands of Sarah, no matter what she is asking of you, for it is through Isaac that your descendants shall bear your name. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a great nation of him also, since he too is your offspring. Early the next morning, Abraham got some bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. And placing the child on her back, he sent her away, and she roamed aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. The water in the skin was used up, so she put the child down under the shrub and then went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away, for she said to herself, let me not watch the child die. As she sat opposite him, he began to cry. Well, he's already like 14 years old, right? So that you can see the narrative got mixed. God heard the boy's cry, and God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven. What is the matter, Hagar? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy's cry in this plight of his. Arise, lift up the boy and hold him by the hand, for I will make of him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water, and then let the boy drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert bowman, with his home in the wilderness of Paran. His mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So Israel will trace the descendants of Ishmael, also with great care, even though he's not the son of the promise. We have a little pact at Beersheba. And then chapter 22, I want to come to, is one of the most famous and significant stories about Abraham, and I would dare say one of the most significant and well-known stories in all of the Old Testament that we're about to come into. And we'll circle back to the Christian understanding at the end. But it too, in its own way, I would call a text of terror. So finally, Abraham has a son, Isaac, and this is the testing called the testing of Abraham. That title in my Bible is not present in the Hebrew text. We just add these titles. The Jewish people call it the binding of Isaac. Sometime after these events, God put Abraham to the test. He called to him, "Abraham." "Ready," he replied. And God said, "Take your son, Isaac, your only one whom you love, your beloved only son." There's a powerful significance to the descriptive language about this son. "Go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer up as a holocaust on a height that I will point out to you." We shall offer him up. So the Lord is saying to Abram, the son that you've been promised is, I'm now asking you, Abram, to go to the land of Moriah and to offer him as a holocaust. Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him his son Isaac, and 2 of his servants as well, and with the wood that he had cut for the holocaust, set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham got sight of the place from afar. Then he said to his servants, "Both of you stay here with the donkey, while the boy and I go on over yonder. We will worship and then come back to you." So he seems to be hiding what he's doing from the 2 servants. Thereupon Abram took the wood for the holocaust and laid it on his son Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. If you have vivid powers of imagination, imagine this. His son is carrying the wood that's going to be used to build the fire to sacrifice him, and Abraham's got the fire and the knife. As the 2 walked on together, Isaac spoke to his father Abraham. "Father," he said. "Yes, son," he replied. Isaac continued, "Here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the holocaust?" "Son," Abraham answered, "God himself will provide," or see to it is literally the translation, "the sheep for the holocaust." Then the 2 continued going forward. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next, he tied up his son Isaac. He bound him and put him on top of the wood on the altar. Then he reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the Lord's messenger called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Yes, Lord," he answered. "Do not lay your hand on the boy," said the messenger. "Do not do the least thing to him. I know now how devoted you are to God, since you did not withhold from me your own beloved son." It's the same language used above, your only beloved son, your only one. As Abraham looked about, he spied a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So he went and took the ram and offered it up as a holocaust in place of his son. Abraham named the site Yahweh Yireh, which literally means the Lord sees, because the Lord saw to the holocaust. Hence the people now say, "On the mountain the Lord will see," or provide. Again the Lord's messenger called to Abraham from heaven and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you acted as you did and not withholding from me your beloved son, I will bless you abundantly and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants shall take possession of the gates of their enemies, and in your descendants all the nations of the earth shall find blessing." Going all the way back to chapter 12. Abraham to be the blessing. "All of this because you obeyed my command." Remember, I said last time, when the Lord called Abraham, what did Paul say? What was the most important thing about Abram? Abram put his trust or his faith in the Lord, and God credited it to him as righteousness. So that goes back to this narrative, that when asked to trust, Abraham put his trust in the Lord, and the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. "All this because you obeyed my command." Abraham then returned to his servants, and they set out together for Beersheba, where Abraham made his home. So, what do you think of this story? All right, so yes, we'll look at the Christian interpretation of the story in a moment, but from the perspective of Abraham and God's people before the time of Christianity, how do you understand the narrative apart? The faithfulness of Abraham for sure, right? That he's willing to even sacrifice the promised son. You've promised me, God, a son, and through that son, descendants, as numerous as the stars of the sky and sands of the seashore, and now God is saying, Abraham, I want you to give up the son. Why would God ask such a thing to begin with? Because, yes, they did. Yes, child sacrifice was indeed practiced in the ancient world. Some cultures believed that their gods wanted children to be sacrificed. And in fact, once God's people, Israel, enter the land of promise, they're surrounded by people who do that. And sometimes Israel falls into the customs of the pagans around them, and they too offer their children in holocaust or sacrifice. So they don't sometimes separate themselves from the morality of the people in which they become immersed. So it could be that this part of the reason behind this narrative is to explain to God's people, look, yes, there are people around you sacrificing children, but this, God did away with that all the way back in Abraham. The Lord provides the sacrifice. It's a sheep. You don't do that to your son. So it could be that part of the reason that the narrative is placed at this point is as a lesson for Israel to say, don't do that.
In the letter to the Hebrews, it says that Abraham believed in resurrection from the dead, and that's why he went through with it.
That's a Christian reinterpretation for sure in Hebrews, that Abraham believed in resurrection from the dead, so that God would raise him from the dead. God would be faithful to his promise. It doesn't seem to be the understanding of Israel or of the Jewish perspective that handed down the story, but we will look at the Christian reinterpretation in a moment because it's very rich. Yes?
I also heard before that the framework of what was happening was just right after, this happened right after Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away.
Yes.
In a way, it's kind of relieving the situation, but now on his own skin. Now he's going away with his only son, and the fact that God says, it's your only son, is because you just sent out your
Oh, you sent the other son away, exactly.
So I
Yeah.
heard that
You sent the other son away, yes. So, you're holding on to one. Now, on one spiritual level, even apart from a Christian reinterpretation, on a spiritual level, there is always a danger in life as spiritual beings that we want to grab onto what God's gifts are to us rather than God. So once I get what I want from God, I'd like to keep that, and I don't need you anymore, God. That's the great danger. So once I get my consolation from you, God, I want to keep my consolation, and you're not so important anymore. I have the Son now. I don't need you. That's the danger spiritually, isn't it? So I have Isaac now, God, really don't need you, thank you, would be the temptation. And so, in a sense, the testing is to refine Abraham's heart, his purity. Do you really trust me, Abraham? Do you really put your faith in me? Am I first in your life? And if so, everything else works together. I'll provide for your son. You don't have to do that. But do you put me first, and do you trust me above all? So it really is, even from the point of view of our Jewish ancestors, it's really a testament to what you might call undivided love for God. And it's interesting, in the New Testament, Jesus, a good Jew, when asked what are the most important commandments, what's the first? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength. An undivided heart, a pure of heart, single-hearted. It's one of the Beatitudes. So I think there's a spiritual lesson for all of us, not to grasp onto the gift that God has given us, whatever that gift might be, and let that become more important than God. If we make something that's good that God gives us more important than God, what does that become? An idol, a god, or ultimately a demon, really, right? If we say something is more valuable to me than God, let's say I say money is more important to me than God, then I've made money my God, haven't I? It's a false god, it's a demon, and in the end it will destroy me, right? So the purity of Abraham's faith is really what's being tested here. It has to be refined in fire. And it is refined in fire. And, the intentionality of God, probably we could say, in one sense, was never the sacrifice of Isaac, but the purity of Abraham's heart. So, but still, it's still a text of terror, isn't it? You're a parent, you think, what? You're going to have me kill my child? Are you crazy? Yes.
I'll make a great nation of your son. Was it Ishmael that the Lord said, or was it Isaac?
Or what verse are you referring to now?
I thought you said that. I apologize. I thought so when Ishmael left,
Yes.
did the Lord say that he'll make a great nation of Ishmael?
Oh, yes. Ishmael will also have a great nation. Yes.
And is Ishmael the father of Muslims? Is he?
Muslims trace their roots back to Abraham through Ishmael. Yes.
So one could say, can you say that this is a foreshadow of the creation of Islam?
That's the way that Islam looks at it for sure. Remember, just like we Christians look back at the old stories of Genesis and see them with a new set of glasses, so too the Muslims do the very same thing. Once they have the Quran, their revelation, they look back to Genesis with their own new set of glasses.
And what does the scholars from Israel and the Jewish?
Well, Jewish scholars would say, of course, that the descendants of Ishmael are indeed the Arabs, and that's where Islam began. They wouldn't contest the fact that Islam began among the Arab peoples, but I dare say that most Jewish scholars probably do not put a lot of credence in a revelation that should take place 800 years later after the New Testament era, nor do all Jewish scholars put a lot of credence in the Christian understanding of things. So, but the respectful scholars, though, would have a respectfulness about other religions. And now, we do, as Christians, there's a whole new horizon in this narrative for us Christians. It's such an important narrative. It is one of the central narratives that is chosen by the church for the lectionary at the vigil of Easter. So these were one of the great stories you'll hear on Holy Saturday if this option is used. Now, why is this story so important for Christians? You all have already been pointing to it. Because we see in Isaac a prefiguring of Jesus, the true beloved son of the true Father. And whereas Abraham was not asked to sacrifice his son, God the Father did allow his son to be sacrificed for us. So for Christians, this would be a foreshadowing. It's preparing us for the ultimate sacrifice of a father who was willing to let his son die. And the parallels of putting the wood on the shoulders of Isaac and Jesus carrying the wood of the cross, Christians will see in all of that typology that's preparing us for the Paschal mystery. So that's why we use it at the Easter Vigil, because Jesus, the true beloved Son of the Father, did indeed lay his life down for us. And that was how God provided, how God saw to it. So in that sense, from our point of view, the meaning of the story of Abraham and Isaac has a whole new depth to it.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, thousands of years later, we're interpreting a lot of this.
From the perspective of the Christ event, yes.
What, at the time it was being written down, do you have any clue what the thought process would have been, or how people understood these?
Well, yeah, you get definite clues in the text itself of why it was important to the narrators of the book of Genesis. A test of his faith, did he really trust the Lord or didn't he? So the great horizon of Abraham and Sarah is that they are prototypical examples of people who really do trust God. They put their faith in God. And we've seen in all the texts, they don't do it perfectly. They keep doubting and questioning. But this is kind of a shining moment when Abraham really did trust God. Okay, I trust you. So the original biblical narrative is all about the shining example that Abraham and Sarah really are, that they put their trust in God. I do believe there's a cultural subtext which we talked about earlier, which was it is Israel's way of saying child sacrifice is really not God's will. Don't do it, right? He made that clear through Abraham. Don't even think about it. So that's the ultimate human evil in a sense. So it's kind of a text to make it clear that is not what God expects. God has other plans. So Israel did have a very extensive sacrificial system in the temple, but it was animals that were offered up. No firstborn son could be offered up. It always had to be, the firstborn son always had to be redeemed. Whereas the firstborn of your sheep or of your other forms of animals, those were offered up to the Lord. It's interesting, why does God always ask for the firstborn animal to be offered as a holocaust?
Is that the purest?
Well, it's the purest, but it's also the first we get from God, right? It's the first gift. So it's like saying, God, you really are first. I'm going to give you the first and trust that you're going to provide beyond this. So I'm going to give you the first and everything else. So the firstborn son always belongs to God. It's redeemed by offering up a sheep, or if you're poor, a turtle dove or something. So there's provision made. But, it's your way of saying, God, this child or this new animal, it's a gift from you and it belongs to you. And so you get the first and the best, God. And I trust that if I give you the first and best, you're going to provide everything else I need. So in a way, the story is already preparing Israel for its whole temple.
3 days of time.
Yes, and it's part of the tithe. The idea of the tithe, the first tenth of your produce also goes to God. Yeah. The Christian dispensation, by the way, is not just the first tenth. We realize all that we have belongs to God. So we're supposed to use everything God has given us for God's glory and honor in a way that befits the goodness of God.
Is Isaac also not an example of being willing to sacrifice? Because he's a young man, a teenager, or whatever at this stage. Abraham was well into his hundreds. If he wanted to, he could have fought his father and gone away.
Oh.
But he accepted that his father was going to offer him, just as Jesus accepted.
Well, yeah, from a Christian point of view, spiritual, you might read that back into the text. I think the text about Isaac here, though, is the obvious reading is that Isaac seemed a bit shell-shocked by the whole thing. Where's the sacrifice going to be, Father? What's going on here? You're not going to do this, are you? And it's interesting. Some commentators say Isaac almost disappears from the biblical text after this. He doesn't make a big splash. It sounds like he never forgot what happened. It's like he kind of begins to disappear from the text. We move right on to Jacob and Esau afterwards. Yeah, it's like he never quite got over what happened. There's certainly multiple layers within the story worth pondering, I think. And one of them is, we would say today, of course, is how God speaks and how one would discern what is authentically God's will versus what one believes is God's will. Because there have been a lot of crazy people in human history who have done really crazy things because they thought God wanted them to do it. So that's always the danger with a person who is convinced this is what God wants me to do. So there's a certain humility that should come with trying to discern what God's will is. And one should also be aware that even though one may believe this is God's will, perhaps one should be humble enough to recognize I could be wrong, and therefore be open to possible revision of that understanding.
You say that with what you just said about Abraham. In terms of just life, how do you imagine this pretty Abraham to sacrifice his son. And when you say it's common, very common practice in that time period to offer children to God.
Yeah, the ancient world had that practice. Yeah, still shocking that a father would do that. Right?
So Abraham, it seems that Abraham had complete confidence that that was God speaking to him. He didn't think, maybe this is, I'm getting this wrong, man. You know?
Nope, he seems absolutely confident, yes.
Relationship, man.
Yeah. No, clearly in this narrative, this is presented as a model of faithful response to God. Now, remember too, these are ancient stories that Israel heard many, many times. They already know the end of the story before they begin the story too. So, but when you're reading it, it certainly has an element of, even though we know the end of the story, it's kind of a nail biter, isn't it? You're like, what? Yeah, there's no way to get around. This is not an easy narrative.
But at the same time, I mean, so it's in a story of terror, as you say, but you peel the onion, right?
Yes.
It's a test.
Yes.
And it's a way to perfect the faith. And I can only believe how much more faithful Abraham was in God. After that, I mean, it would have been a new level. And at the same time, I think it's also beautiful. Obviously, in principle, the test is coming inflicted by God, but the spin around from that is to say God was at all times with him.
Yes.
Until the very last second, and he walked him through the test.
Yes, God was always with him and walking through it. And God's intentionality, God already knew what God was going to do, right?
So there is
For
a
the
nice
outset.
story.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Even when you read it at the Easter Vigil, there are still some people in the pews, right, who are kind of listening, like, what? What is happening in the story here? You know? Chapter 23, we come to the death of Sarah. And, Abraham is extremely careful to purchase the burial place for Sarah. So and it will ultimately also be his burial place as well. And then chapter 24 is going to lead us to the next ancestors, Isaac and Rebekah. So we have the death of Abraham approaching, but before he dies, after securing the burial place for Sarah, he has one important thing to do, and that is to make sure that Isaac gets a wife from their own people. So that's the beautiful narrative in chapter 24 about the wedding of Isaac with Rebekah. And we'll be looking at that in a couple of weeks when we get back together. But it's a betrothal scene that takes place because of a meeting at a well. And this is a famous biblical context for brides and grooms to meet. And in the New Testament, we'll see in John's Gospel, after we hear about a wedding at Cana, Jesus meets a woman at a well. So John's Gospel is full of nuptial wedding imagery all through it. So, and it's actually quite a beautiful story. So if you have not read that far along, keep reading. But we'll hear about how Abraham arranges the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. Then we go straight to the birth of Esau and Jacob. So very quickly. So Isaac really does kind of disappear from the story. He's the promised son, and then boom, he's the father of Jacob and Esau. So he's the link in generations. All right. Final questions tonight about Abraham and Sarah. Or things that struck you.
Well, I'm a little jealous of the clarity that Abraham has when God speaks to him. It's like, if you were going to modern counseling, they said, go sacrifice your son. You go into your therapist and they're going to say, I don't think so. You know what I mean? He's listening, God's talking to him, and I envy Abraham's
Clarity, moral clarity, yes. It is interesting. I think St. Ignatius says sometimes in life we get what he calls a first kind of certainty where we're really certain this is God's will. It's just clear. At other times we really have to wrestle and get clarity through proper discernment. Yes.
One of the things I love about Abraham's story is God saying he will be a blessing to all the nations of the world. And, that's echoed again later on in the story here. It's a marvelous thing to think about. Here's this one man in his encounter with God and his journey of faith. And how does that being a blessing to all the nations manifest itself through time?
Absolutely. That's a key theological focus, I think, of that whole narrative. Abraham, I'm calling you, not for your own sake, but to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. It's God's intentionality to bless all human beings everywhere because of Abraham's yes to God, his fidelity. And by the way, Sarah also, in her own right, is an incredible figure of trust in the Lord and remarkable leader. I also like the fact that because our ancestors handed on all the narratives that were stitched together as they are now, that they didn't just preserve the stories that make Abraham and Sarah look perfect. So the messiness of the human condition is woven in, fully intact, and I think that's very important. But it's not a narrative of, these are not narratives of perfect people. They're narratives of people who are our ancestors in faith and did a lot of right things and trusted God, and God promised a lot to them, but they also failed a lot and struggled with a lot. And all the messiness is kept intact in the narrative. So when you read some of those stories and you think, why did they leave this in the Bible? Maybe that's part of the reason they left this in the Bible, even though it's kind of shocking to read some of those things.
If this is part of the text that was written about 900, I wonder if there's not a historical context to it, right? Because it's after the Kings. There's a question whether Israel's going to be a nation. And yet, you have this kind of bumpy road that we have. After Isaac is saved, God says to Abraham the same thing he has said over and over again. I'm going to make you the number of the stars, I'm going to make you the sands of the sea, so it's the same promise again.
Yes.
And it's being written in the same time period.
Yeah, the narrative itself, basic narrative text, has layers that go back to clearly to the 9th century, probably in written form, but there's also editors at work in the 500s during the exile, when God said they've lost the land. What happened? Do we still trust God today? Will God still be faithful to his promise? And especially those elements about being a blessing, that's priestly language, and that's probably the final person who got his hand on the text. So he gets his chance to frame the theological narrative in the end. And of course, because we're looking at both human authorship and divine, God's purpose in the text unfolding as it did is to teach key theological truths, and we've been exposed to many of them as we've gone through the early chapters of Genesis, kind of the core theological principles. You could probably start making a list. What were the core theological things we've learned in Genesis? All is created by God. God alone baras. God creates all that is. All created good. God's intentions were all good for humanity. It was the misuse of human freedom that got us off track. The destructiveness we see around us in the world flows out of that original turning from God. God is still at work, blessing in the midst of the brokenness. He's still calling people. Think of Noah protecting creation and the chaos, preserving it for the next future generation. Noah would be, I don't know if Pope Francis used in this encyclical Laudato Si, but Noah's a great figure for your responsibilities to take care of these created things God put on earth. Don't destroy them. Make sure they live for the next generations coming along. Abraham, that God is faithful to his promise. God will bless all humanity through him. So there are layers and layers of theological truth that God is inspired and that he wants to be us inspired with. And every time we reread the text, we're being invited into the narrative. So why do you think the church uses the story of Isaac at the Easter Vigil? Well, all these folks are there that evening about to be baptized in water and confirmed. They've said yes to God. Perhaps some of them are wondering, am I making the right choice? Am I a little afraid of this? Do I trust? Will I say yes to the promises of baptism that come up shortly after the readings? Do you believe? Yes, I believe. It's preparing the new Catholics to say, yes, I trust you, God. And it's also for those of us who are walking with them, we have our own struggles with faith all year long, don't we? Just like everybody else on the planet. Do I trust you, God? Am I willing to reaffirm my faith in you? So the text is still speaking to us today. God, it seems like the most important thing in my life has been taken away. Do I still trust you? So the text, because it's the inspired word of God, is still speaking. God is still speaking to us through that text. So that's why we can keep saying new meanings from our point of view. It continues to shed a new light on our journey. All right, well, y'all have a wonderful week off next week. Keep reading. It gets better. It doesn't just get worse, it gets better. If you can finish with Genesis, that'll give you a picture of the whole. If you're that far along, keep reading through Exodus. If you've been zooming along, if you're listening to it and you want to go through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you'll get the whole package as you go. So we do have this thing called a Christmas break. So if you don't make it all the way through all 5 books and you do want to read the whole Bible with this course, there's ample time during the break periods to keep reading ahead. So, all right, go in the peace of Christ.